to this evening's Facilities Committee meeting, the third of a series of meetings to discuss the enrollment capacity and some of our directions moving forward. This evening, we have an agenda that has basically 5 components to it. We're going to recap at first the process we've used to date, as well as some meetings and upcoming meetings that we're going to be holding for purposes of continuing to hear from you, your thoughts on the information that's being shared. In the packet that you're receiving in the back, there are resources that we have listed in there on the website, district website. All these materials that we're distributing are also found there, and color maps and color graphs that make some of the information a little bit clearer for you. You can find that on the district website. We're going to be talking tonight about some of the ideas that were been shared by you at the podium here, other ideas that have been sent to us via email, and discussion of ideas that have been shared in our focus group meetings as well, and what our thoughts are with regard to those, things that we felt were viable and things we felt were not necessarily viable, but that discussion will also be held this evening. And then moving from there, we're going to move to what we are referring to as 3 blended solutions that we see as moving forward to be put forth to the public as 3 ways that we can budgetarily manage the enrollment capacity needs in the district going forward, and some of the pros and cons of each of those blended options, and we will look for your ideas in response to them as well. And that public comment section will be in the final phase. And we're hoping this evening to move through pretty quickly through the information and allow more opportunity for the public to come to the podium and ask questions and share ideas and impressions based on the work that we're doing. Up to this point, we've held, of course, public board meetings, at which time there has been some information shared about the growing enrollment capacities here in the district, our buildings, and some of the needs we have moving forward. We've had these 3 facility committee meetings specially designed to speak to the elementary enrollment capacity issues and to formulate ideas based on your thinking and what your ideas and concerns are. And following this meeting this evening, there'll be 4 meetings coming up, one at each of the 4 elementary schools, one at Stony Creek on March 20th, one at Bluebell on March 21st, on April 9th, one at Shady Grove, and on April 23rd, Lower Gwinnett. And of course, as members of the public, you are welcome to come to any one of them, or all 4 of them, but these are 4 different meetings focusing on the same topic with the same information we shared at all 4, though we expect that at each school, the flavor of that school's involvement in these blended options will be a focus of primary discussion. But again, all public are welcome to all 4 of those particular meetings. In addition to that, we've had some internal meetings. We've had a focus group that consists of 3 representatives from each of the elementary schools. We've had 2 meetings so far, and we have 2 more to go. And this is yet another forum where we have an opportunity to hear from members of the public from each of the school communities to hear thinking, raise ideas, raise questions, discuss with the administrative team, and share their thinking as well. There have been meetings with municipal officials from Ambler, Lower Gwinnett, and Whitpain, 1 so far in each one of those particular groups. And the purpose of those, of course, is to share with them the concerns we have about the continuing growth, what's happening in each of those communities, municipalities, in terms of continued building, and try to just make sure that the community is well informed as what's happening in the school district and the impact of the work that's going on. Of course, we're working with the architects, and those meetings have been fairly numerous, phone calls, conference calls, back and forth, in an attempt to share the latest renditions of our thinking in terms of what we might need, what that will cost, what's the feasibility of these particular plans, all of that. And of course, the district leadership team, including our building principals and directors, have been involved as well in multiple meetings and many conversations as we continue to discuss these various options that we have. And just to revisit a little bit the enrollment projections and the information on that, Dr. Crisfield.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Good evening, everybody. This part of the meeting is a little bit of a transition from the first, which is where we've been, to a reminder about the resources. this is not in, our intent here is not to rehash everything we've already done because we'll be here for too long. But I did want to put up a few things that kind of set the stage with regard to the enrollment. And you may recall that the 3 lines, and all of these things are available on the website. The 3 lines up there were the basis for starting this conversation. The top 2, the red line and the blue line, are enrollment projections that were created by a professional company, DI, Decision Insight, that does this as a vocation. The green line below is just what we would use for our normal budgetary projections that just use historical averages. That green line will soon go away. But in any event, you just see the shape of these. And these lines' shapes permeate all of our thinking because enrollment in any of the 2 that they have is going up and rather substantially in the case of the red one. The red one's called the moderate, that's their word, and the blue one's called the conservative. So the key to all of these enrollment projections is what happens in a given year with kindergarten registration and enrollment. So on this graph, also available on the website, but I just want to set the stage here. The black line is historical actuals of kindergarten registration on the first day of school. And then the 3 lines are what the 3 enrollment projections assume to be kindergarten as we move on in the years. So this here is 2019, so that's what the 3 projections are assuming to be registration, kindergarten totals, come first day of this coming school year in August. You can see that the conservative suggests we're going to have 364, the moderate suggests we're going to have 379. The green is what we just use as our historical average, our historical 5-year average of 338. And this here number, 2018, was the one that really kind of put this into hyper gear because now we had 390 this existing school year. So, this is actually one of the checkpoints for us, is when we get a sense of kindergarten registration and actuals for September of 2019, that'll give us a sense of which of these 2 numbers, if either one of them, is kind of on track. And a little teaser alert, we've had our registration, and it's looking like right there is the registration right now, and we're only in March. So that gives us a checkpoint. We're not done counting registrations. Sometimes students will come and go, what have you, but it's not like we're down here, and last year was an anomaly.
What's the number, Jim?
The current registration packets received and processed is 352, and many more come in as the summer goes on. Okay. So the next 2 are also not spending much time on, but just to give you a sense of where or how we ended up with some of these solutions or thinking on ideas that were offered up. These 2 lines, not going to go into detail right now, but this is the capacity of our schools now, our 4K to 5, in our preferred world. And this line is the capacity of our K-5 schools in what we're calling a compromised way, which we can get away with sharing rooms and putting kids in different places and maybe alternate scheduling, things that are not ideal but is doable. And then these are the same exact enrollment projections, so those haven't changed. This is an example, though, of what we call a plus 332 scenario, where we're adding somewhere 15 classrooms. So that jumps up the capacities from these 2 numbers just slide up exactly 332. And then you see where the various enrollment possibilities would land if we had 332 more spaces in some fashion. And you can see that if we don't do something, we're going to have our capacity exceeded very quickly. And this, I'll go back one place. And this is the same thing just if we add 266, which is 12 classrooms. There's roughly, we count on roughly 22 students in a classroom on average. But in any event, you can see that if we do this, it's adding a little less capacity, but if the moderate version hits, then we'll actually be underserved in the future.
And as mentioned earlier, all of the materials and support going way back to the initial meetings is still all housed on the website. So again, any of those materials you'd like to see, please go to the website and check in with the materials there. So you will remember at our second meeting of the Facilities Committee here, we introduced the idea of the map of the school district. And we pointed out that in order to honor any kind of redistricting givens that we were supposed to try to maintain for the purposes of redistricting, we were going to keep in mind close proximity, not taking kids from far distances and moving them to over another school to get to a new school, try to keep it geographically contiguous. We then carved up some pieces, as you can see on this map, as identified by A, B, C, etc. And it tells you in each of those puzzle pieces, as I'm looking at it, or community areas, the number of students currently enrolled in that particular section of the community. One of the challenges we face as we move forward is that most of the growth, much of the increase of enrollment is down in the Stony Creek region. That's where most of it is occurring. And so one of the challenges we had here, initially we were looking at redistricting as a solution for the coming year. We realized very quickly that once we did redistricting for this coming year, 2019-20, the problem would be that we would likely have to redistrict yet again. And one of the agreements was in the beginning we would try to steer clear from having to redistrict twice. So that became really a challenge. How do you do that now, when you know in the long run, if you do any kind of building, you're going to have to redistrict at that time to make sure the population is properly distributed so it matches up with the facilities that we have. So from the public and the community, we received numbers of ideas that are posted on this slide that share with you options that were put forth. So the first one, as an example, comprehensive 2019 redistricting, for the reasons I shared just now, that's something we've turned away from at this point. Doesn't seem like a logical thing. And in fact, just to reiterate, at March 4th, last Monday's board meeting, Dr. Crisfield announced publicly that we would not be redistricting for 2019 and 20. That was a concern we heard clearly, and we felt at this point that that was not necessarily the solution long-term that would help us. So that kind of is pulled away from the table. So all the things that we talk about this evening are really based upon that sort of understanding. We also were recommended we might look at increasing class guidelines, expand 3 schools, demolish 1, create 4-5 building, K-1 building, 7-9 building. All of these different options were things that were shared, put forth, and considered. So the question might be as to why those ideas are not being considered going further. Why are they not being pursued at this time? So the first one, the comprehensive redistricting, either in 2019 or in the future, basically was for the reasons I said. Most of the growth tends to be in the Stony Creek region. Doing a redistricting now is not going to do the ultimate solution for us in the long term anyway. So if we can avoid doing that now and handle that in a different way, that might be more positive, and certainly feedback we have received through our focus group and through the public who share with us feedback, that was seen as a smart move not to do the redistricting at this particular time. The other option was to increase class size guidelines, so just to put more kids in each of the classrooms throughout the district. I can tell you in my role in the district, I'm the one that often will hear from the public if there's a concern about class size. Even when we're staying within the agreed upon guidelines established by our board, parents will still call and say, I think 25 students in my son's class is too many. Yet that is our guideline, that's where we are. So the thought of increasing at this point didn't appear to be something that our community would be with happily or feel that was the right thing. We choose also, as professionals, don't think adding to the numbers there in that way would make good sense. Historically, our average has been 22.18, but when you actually take a school that has maybe 2 classes for 4th grade, you may have 2 very large classes, and to break it into 3 would actually reduce it even much lower. It's hard to do that district-wide when you're thinking about staffing and budgetary constraints as well. third one was ideas. Okay, so the ideas that are listed here were those that would exceed the maximum cost of $35 million, which is then out of the realm of possibility from a budgetary standpoint. Our district knows its capability in terms of borrowing at this point. $35 million is too high, and these ideas would all be that and possibly even more in terms of budget. So they've been eliminated based on that. Looking at just the second one as an example, demolish existing Stony Creek building and build new and bigger one. On the surface, that may sound like maybe that in the 21st century may be a good idea, but when you think about it, we also have a number of students in that building who also have to be educated during the building process, so where are they going? So that yet is another concern that would be obvious here. There was consideration and discussion about possibly moving the 5th grade to the middle school and or moving the 8th grade to the high school. And again, we explored that in terms of the addition to the middle school, and that is a fairly costly one that also would require some core facility improvements to manage the number of kids there. And we also realized there was an encroachment on the parking situation, which is already challenging. Encroachment on sports fields, or maybe a loss of sports fields would be another. And if any of you have been on the line on Houston Road at pickup or dismissal time, adding another 350 kids to that zone might not be the easiest thing for us to do in terms of traffic and that piece. So that's just some of the issues associated there. In terms of ideas that pose substantial annual busing and administrative costs and create transition concerns, I would like to just speak a little bit to the transition piece here. When you speak about a K building or a K1 building, you automatically are beginning to talk about multiple transitions from one school to another school to another school. And a school where children spend 1 year or possibly 2 years requires parents, by the time they get in and their child has 1 full year, and then by the middle of the next year, already thinking about how do you get ready to prepare to go to the next building. At the elementary level, I think our families are used to establishing strong connections with their elementary faculty and administrators, and I think it's a time to build relationships. Our K students and our K parents are often the ones that work very hard to establish good, positive working relationships with them and build a sense of trust that you're here and we love the fact that you're here. And that takes time to work on. And the thought of starting out with a K1 or a K center and then moving them the next year, they have to get used to a whole new group before, and it's such an important time in a young child's career in elementary. Creating a 4 or 5 building would be probably more acceptable on that end of it if you were going to do such a thing. But again, all of these, when you create a 4 or 5 building for the district, you are now busing children from every part of the district to another district central location, or hopefully center, but maybe not center. And that's another challenge, just in terms of the busing costs, but also time on the bus and all of the pieces that get associated with that. These were some of the other ideas. I'll point out one. One was the idea of taking the current central office and converting that to a school. But the school, that's facility size itself would not be able to probably accommodate even a full grade in our district at this point, and certainly with any kind of a gym facility, cafeteria facility, any kind of things of that sort. The other option was to consider if there was any kind of a commercial building in the district that could be retrofitted as a temporary elementary environment for the coming year or coming few years. And the thought of doing that was rather cost prohibitive when you think of taking commercial corporate center site and trying to turn it into a school that is appropriate for young children with bathroom facilities, gym facilities, any of the things that we would actually need to deliver our program. And these are some of the other ideas that are up here. Add all 15 classrooms onto Stony Creek. It didn't seem to make sense to put all 15 there when we would want to try to distribute them a little bit to more than one site. So the district at least had some options to send students closer to the geographical where they live. And so that was seen as another important piece. But again, these ideas that were shared, we all talked about them. There was a fair amount of discussion on them. In the focus groups, we shared these as well and got feedback from the focus group membership. And we've had informal conversations along the way with people. In fact, the idea of the elementary, our central office becoming an elementary school was something we actually shared internally as a thought. Like, is it possible to make this a more viable school option and then relocate administration to another site? But again, the size of the site and the size of the building itself didn't seem to accommodate that number. And that leads us then into what we're going to present tonight to you, which are really 3 blended solutions. And for that, I'm going to turn that over to Dr. Christie.
Thank you, Gary. And what we'll do is, these 3 ideas are not the end all, but they're blended in the sense that they have some short-term impact, which we're going to talk about, and then long-term. We'll get through these 3 and not spend a whole lot of time on them, but I do want everyone to understand them, and then we'll have opportunity for board members and members of the public to ask questions about what Gary just discussed is a list of which are other ideas, and then these. So these all have some common aspects, these 3. They're blended because they're going to have minimally some, if not probably a lot of use of modulars until such time as the construction can get complete. That's just unavoidable. You saw it on the slides that showed the enrollment spikes in 2023. So when we do have modulars in use, if they're used for related arts or encore classes, such as the one that is in use now at Stony, they most likely would not be attached, but we do have a human an aide to go back and forth with the students. If, and it's quite likely, that some of these would require some number of years of modulars for homerooms, then that set of modulars would be attached to the building in some fashion. No students are being redistricted, as Gary mentioned, in 2019, and then in all 3 of these, between 0 and 40 students are being redistricted, depending on the option. All of them have student and staff safety as a top priority during all construction phases, and there are checkpoints built in along the way. I mentioned earlier the kindergarten registration. That's one. We already have a rough sense of that now this year, but we'll continue to do that every year. We'll have our contractor update the enrollment projections every year. A really important checkpoint is in the next probably 2 or 3 weeks, the Montgomery County Planning Commission is going to give us another line, another enrollment projection. They're good at this. They're a government entity, so they're kind of backed up in terms of requests, but we gave them all of our information. They're dialed into trends in Montgomery County, and we're going to use their projection, overlay that on the map or on the slide with the other 2, and give us maybe a sense of which of those 2 lines, if either one of them makes any sense. So this first blended solution is being termed SG because the other part of the construction in this case would be happening at Shady Grove. You'll note that in all 3 of the blended solutions under consideration, and nothing is set in stone and we can do something different, but we're just throwing some ideas out there, all 3 of them have the same outcome for Stony Creek, actually, which is where, as Gary mentioned, that's most of the growth is happening. So in all 3, the same classroom additions or construction is happening there, which would be a brand new multi-purpose room, and then recapturing the existing gym and the existing cafeteria as classroom spaces. In this case, we would also add 4 classrooms at Shady Grove, so that totals 16 classrooms, in the form, in this case, of a new cafeteria, and then converting the old cafeteria to classrooms. We would relocate the autistic support program, which is now at Shady, to Stony Creek with some new state-of-the-art facilities that are really awesome learning spaces for students with autism. And then 1 small district, Zone D, would be going from Bluebell to Shady once the construction is done. So the pros and cons are listed up there. I won't go over each one of them, but just some highlights. In all 3 of these, one of the things that I think needs to be highlighted here is, in addition to Stony Creek students being able to congregate in one place, which they can't now, we would have another gym facility, another community resource for after hours and weekends for the community to use in basketball programs or any other sort of activities. many of you probably know just how scarce that is here and how much of a demand issue we have. So I think that's a really nice feature of this. It's within the budget. All 4 schools will eventually be able to accommodate the growth. Some of the cons, though, the new classrooms at Shady would be inside the building, so no exterior windows. That's not great. That's not ideal. That's probably along the lines of the compromise. It's not the end of the world. It's just not perfect. And this particular solution might end up with slightly too much capacity at Shady, and it does indeed redistrict some students. So this is what it would look like each for the schools. The current enrollment and capacity are in gray there, and then if we were to pursue this, the eventual, because it's going to take about 3.5 years to do all this construction. So we're using like September 2023 as the start date for the new regime. And you can see that there would be a little more capacity in both Shady and Stony, and Shady would receive some students from Bluebell, that small redistricted zone. Just trying to balance things out. The second is termed LG because the additional little bit of construction would be happening in Lower Gwinnett in this case. 4 classrooms on in Lower Gwinnett, and then the same exact scenario over at Stony. We would relocate the autistic support again from Shady to Stony, and in this case, in addition to redistricting 40 students from Bluebell, we'd also relocate the emotional support program from Bluebell to Lower Gwinnett. All of these things are intended to try to fine-tune the capacity as best we can project it and the enrollment so that all schools can fit within their projected enrollment and their projected capacities. The pros here, again within budget. By the way, the budget, and we talked about this last time, is comprised of borrowing a maximum of $28 million. That's as much as we can borrow. Even if we want to borrow more, we can't, because we don't have the resources in the budget. And then the rest of the money would come from, in form of cash, from the capital reserve account, which is a pot of money that's used for capital projects. We can take some of it, and it's perfectly legitimate to use it for this sort of purpose. It's just we'd like to minimize that use of that cash if we can. This, the pros, similar, Stony Creek, another gym, so forth. Emotional support program being close to central office is nice. The supervisor is that much closer for the students who might need support. This is the least expensive option. It's actually a little bit of a hedge against future mermaid development, because if to the extent that happens in Bluebell will have a little bit more capacity in this one. And the con, really, it's again, some students are being redistricted. Here are the outcomes by school. In this case, Stony gets more capacity, and Shady gets a little more also because their autistic program is leaving. Bluebell gets more capacity because the emotional support program is leaving, and Lower Gwinnett gets more capacity because they're building on there.
Question, construction time for this one?
All the construction times are about the same, where we're projecting being fully ready in fall of 2023, and it's possible that a piece of it, maybe the common area, could be a year earlier, although it's not too likely.
Jim, can you explain on that one chart you right there? So for Lower Gwinnett, it says the current capacity there would be 577 on the low end, and then the projected enrollment would be 596. So the capacity that you're talking about making is 622.
Correct. 622 would be the preferred, and it could go all the way up to compromise to 688. Okay, and then the final of the three is what we're calling the BB for, you guessed it, Bluebell. This one is subject to a little more detailed study of the Bluebell site plan, because the property lines are a little tight, and we were just eyeballing things, but this would be the same scenario at Stony, and then the additional 4 at Bluebell. This additional 4 would take the form of a new all-purpose room at Bluebell, just the same sort of thing we're building at Stony. So that the nice additional pro of this one is that all of the Bluebell students could then also congregate at once. And we have a second gym community resource. And then to capture the classrooms, we would take the old or the existing Bluebell cafeteria and gym and convert those to classrooms. This is within budget, but it's most costly of the three. And the pros are kind of the same. All schools will be able to congregate in one place. The students, and this one is nice that no students are redistricted, 0. And this also gives us a little hedge against mermaid development. And lastly, this is what the outcome would be if we pursued this. The enrollment projection column is unchanged because we're not redistricting any students, and we're just adjusting capacities a little bit here and there.
Jim,
Question?
for clarification, these numbers, I know that you're consulting with resident architects. Can we get some further explanation about the square footage we're talking about? These costs seem extraordinarily high, given that a whole elementary school could be built for 40-some million, potentially.
Okay.
So,
Yes, we definitely can. Gary, would you go one more slide, please, just to... There we go. Okay. Now, Steve, if you would, you heard the question, and I'll just repeat the question for everybody. The question is, how were cost estimates derived, either by square foot or the sort of renovation versus new construction? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Certainly. Thank you. The methodology that we use at this very early stage of the assessments are based on including 2 components generally in it. One is the hard cost, the actual cost of the bricks and mortar. The second component is the soft cost, and that's fees and permits and associated things that are required for the complete project. So what we use, our firm's been around for 50 years, so we have a large database of historical data on school construction in this area. And we monitor historical inflation trends as well as what projections are looking to be. And then so we take that data to the point that, to the degree that the scope is defined at this point, and looking at the geography, looking at the site constraints, at those variables that might affect those square footage numbers, that's what we then integrate into it. They also include contingency, so they are by design conservative. We want to make sure we're not overselling what can be accomplished for those dollars. So, and historically, we've been pretty accurate with those as well. So, does that answer the question?
not really.
Okay.
I'd be looking more for a square footage estimate, which I know is regularly used by other places when developing guidelines for construction. Because again, new construction, a complete elementary school could be in the realm of $45 million. So I'm trying to understand how an addition is $30 million.
Okay, well, it is based on square footage. I should have mentioned that. That's our data. And it's related to the degree of complexity of the proposed addition or renovation. And so we do have the backup for these things that went into those numbers. But it's been carefully evaluated, and yeah, we can provide it to the board.
Have we thought about putting another floor on any of these schools, like Bluebell or Stony? Would that cost less if we're building up instead of out, since we wouldn't be putting drainage and, I mean, I know we would be, having to do more support on the schools that are there, but.
The buildings are not designed for another level, so all of the steel as well as the foundations that support it the structure of the building is not designed for additional floors. So bringing in that additional structure would be very costly. And then you need additional stair towers and other associated construction that you wouldn't otherwise have.
So do you have the general square footage of the addition you would be expecting to put on with, let's say, 14 classrooms?
That's correct, yes. In each case, we have a rough square footage of the anticipated addition, and then we're using that with the cost per square foot.
Could you share that this evening, is what I mean? You would have that information with you?
We'll get that.
Yeah, not in a format that's really easy to pull out now, but we can.
Jim, I got it. So, I mean, rather than discussing, the specifics or the precision of like the cost estimates and all, I mean, my concerns are more fundamental than that. I mean, I'm not convinced with the information that we've seen that construction and added capacity at the scale that we're talking about is necessary. And I think for me, the projections, the way I interpret them, it's kind of leads me down a different path. My concern is that all the options that are there are plenty of options on the table, and we eliminated a bunch for mostly, it seemed like valid and legitimate reasons. But the only options that the administration is putting on the table for us as a board to consider all involve pretty costly construction, in the neighborhood of $30 million plus. And again, even getting away from the precision of those numbers, I'm not convinced that that level of construction and added capacity is necessary. And mainly because, like if you go back to slide 6, Jim, can you? So slide 6 is the sheet that talks about kindergarten enrollment and the kindergarten cohort size. And this is probably the biggest driver of the overall enrollment projections going forward, because the kindergarten cohort makes its way through our entire system, K through 12. And if it's really large, like it was this year, 390 versus a historical average of 338, that's an extra 50 kids in the system. And then if that every single year we're getting an extra 50 kids, I mean, that starts piling up and adding up a lot. And then we can have really big numbers down the road. I guess it's a possibility, but with 1 year of a blip to 390, I'm not sure that that's the new benchmark, or it's just, again, a blip. Now, the moderate projections, which is like the red curve at the top, it seems to be assuming that for the foreseeable future, for the next 10 years, that our kindergarten cohort size is going to be close to that 390 figure. I mean, it goes up a little bit, then comes down a little bit, but on average it's about 386, 87, so close to 390. Again, the assumption that the 1 year blip we've had, which could be an anomaly, is going to continue for 10 years, and that has a dramatic increase in the total enrollment and what our projected capacity needs are. That to me seems overly aggressive, and I think it confuses the issue. And I would say that we should just completely eliminate that from all the slides going forward, because I think that's, while a possibility, not as likely as the conservative projection, which assumes that the kindergarten cohort is going to come down from that 390 figure, but remain elevated on average above and beyond the 338 that we've experienced historically over the last 5 years. But even in that case, and actually in both cases, you see the kindergarten cohort size start to decrease once you get 5 years out. So we're talking about building options that bring a lot of capacity online in 2023, but that's around the time when either projection you're looking at, the kindergarten cohort start to shrink again. And so we're building capacity and adding a lot of capacity, a lot of space for kids that are not going to be consistently there 5+ years down the road potentially, in either scenario.
And I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I was just going to
Debbie.
piggyback on that. I mean, I would concur 100% what you're saying. And additionally, given that our debt service is limiting us to, let's say, $30 million of spending, and we're taking some of that from capital improvement, it would be, what we're doing, I feel, would be analogous if you are a family with one child and you have a pregnancy and another child on the way, and you're thinking with your spouse, well, we're going to have a third child down the road, maybe, and you're going to take your last $30,000 and add an addition to your home with the supposition that you're going to need it before you even need it. And then, again, looking down the road, looking at the birth rate in the U.S. and the growth rate in population in Wissahickon, doesn't support that this is going to be ongoing well beyond 2023, 25.
But we're not talking about the birth rate in the United States. We're talking about the number of people who are moving into our district who have children. And I've heard a lot of people talking about on their blocks, there are a lot of old people and who were there when the place was built. Now they're moving out and people are moving in with children. So you can't look at it from the national or the world birth rate. You have to see what's happening with Wissahickon. We are right. We are a very attractive district. Our taxes historically have been low. Our education has been top notch, and that's one reason people are constantly moving in. And the spikes that you see in the graphs earlier is recognition of that, and to ignore the fact that we are very attractive is to we're going to be putting us into a major bind, and we have to do this over and over and over again. I'm sorry.
So if I could just add though, it's not just the birth rate, looking at the growth rate in Wissahickon compared to other districts in Pennsylvania, we are about 89th in growth. And there are many Montgomery County districts that are not superior to us. I mean, we're fantastic academically, there's no doubt. But it has to do with population growth and room to move in. And so again, I'm not just talking about national. I'm talking about the statistics in this district as compared to other districts in Montgomery County as well as Pennsylvania. And so I would hope that, and I know Jim's waiting to get the information from Montgomery County, those predictions, and certainly we would need to hear those numbers to help guide us.
Yeah, I'd say certainly either scenario, the one that Ron talked about, potentially a lot more growth, or the one Debbie talked about, not that much growth, either scenario is possible. The issue to me is that at this point, with the information we have, there's a lot of uncertainty which direction it's going to go. And whatever decisions we make, especially if we're going to move forward with large construction to the tune of $30+ million, that's going to have a long-term impact on the finances of the district. And I'm not convinced that we should move there, given the enrollment data and projections that we have in front of us right now. A couple years down the road, we'll have a better sense, and we'll see which scenario is more likely to play out. And then at that point, I think we'd be in a better position to make a better informed decision about what to do long term regarding capacity in the district. If you go to slide 7, there you get the page through all 15 slides to get back there. No, okay. So in slide 7, which has overall enrollment projections, but again, the red is based on the assumption that the kindergarten cohort stays close to 390 every year for the next 10 years, which I think is unrealistic. And so I think we should just completely eliminate that from discussion here, because the moderate one, or the conservative one, is more, I think, plausible. If you take that red curve out of the mix, the projections that we're looking at are building a lot of excess capacity that we as a district don't really need. And if I'm looking at our current capacity, 23, 29, which is the straight orange line, and then compared to the blue curve, there isn't that big of a gap in terms of capacity that we have to deal with. That could be addressed through the addition of some modular construction, which is lower cost. And also at the same time, a few years down the road, we can get a sense, again, how are the curves developing? It could be that if we move forward with some of the options that are on this still move forward to consider list, that we'd be building hundreds of extra seats at K-5 that 5-10 years down the road, we don't need. And that's not a good outcome for us either. I mean, again, I'll also financially, that's not a good move for the district longer term. So again, I have serious reservations. I'm not convinced that we need to move forward to consider any of the large-scale addition or construction options on the table right now.
In light of the time, I wanted to make sure that the public had an opportunity to share some thinking and maybe raise some questions about what you've heard this evening. So at this time, we'd like to invite anyone who'd like to speak to come down to the podium and share any questions, comments, thoughts.
Jonathan Campos, Silk Wrestling, Amber PI. I'd like Mr. Antonio to articulate why the red line needs to come off the table.
In my view, that projection is more aggressive than I think is plausible. But again, the key thing is that it assumes that our kindergarten cohort size is going to stay in the neighborhood of 390 students a year, every year for the next 10 years. Now, we've had 390 students in kindergarten this year, but that's 1 year, when in the previous 5 years we've averaged 338 kids.
Okay.
So, I mean, again, it's possible that could be the new benchmark of how many kids we have coming in kindergarten, but it's also possible that that's a 1 year blip.
It is, but you're making a decision on 1 year. Are you not?
Yeah.
Well, the other way around is making a decision on 1 year also, but just the other way.
Sure, but you have a 4-year build time on this stuff. So, your analogy about the house is great, but if I wanted to, I can move next year, I can move in 3 months. Can you build in 3 months or more?
But that's what we're saying, 3 years down the road, by the time the building is built, we may not need the space anymore.
You may not, you may need more.
You're right, which is why we're suggesting something more conservative going forward. Rather than making the decision, we're going to have this trend of 390 every year, add these modular classrooms. Again, we're talking about, you all have elementary kids maybe at this point. All that blip, that 390 kids is making their way up to the high school. How do we know we're not going to need room at the high school? We will have no debt service left. We would have used all of our remaining money on the guess that we're going to need that space at the elementary level.
But you had talked before about replenishing that debt service. So
That's-
once that gets in, has anybody projected that?
Yes, we have, and when
Where
we
does that went?
pools paid off basis.
Once the pool fails.
I don't have that number, Gary. Have our basis.
How long is the full debt?
Cool debt?
You know, long?
So to bring this full circle, we can get the pool debt number later. You're basing this on an assumption for 1 year. You don't have any better data. It's just an assumption that you're making
What assumption are you referring to?
about the 390. So you're basing your decision that the red line is too aggressive based on 1 year of data.
I'm basing it on the fact that we have 5 years of prior data that showed our kindergarten cohort sizes averaging about 338 kids.
But it keeps going up. And we keep having
And
potentially more
we've had
capacity.
we've had 1 year of 390. After next, when we see what happens in the fall, if it's at 390 again, then it makes it more plausible. If it's like at 340, then it's something else. If it's at 360, who knows? But I would say between the two, I think the conservative projection, the blue curve, is a more reasonable one for us to use for planning purposes than the red one.
So I just want to make sure there's nothing else that hasn't been disclosed here that you're basing your decision.
No, I mean, you guys have seen the same data that I've seen.
It bothers me viscerally that this is called the K-5 capacity meeting. Because this is not a K-5 problem, this is a K-12 problem. And we're only talking about K-5. These kids that are kindergartners this year will be in the middle school and they will be in the high school. And nobody is talking about this long-term solution. We're only talking about the solution for the next 5 years. I agree that we should not be hanging all our hopes on 1 year of 390 students. 7 years ago, we were told, sworn up and down, that our attendance, our enrollment at Wissahickon was going to plummet to the point that not only were we supposed to close one school, that we were probably going to another elementary school. That's what we were told 6 years ago. So now we have that reverse problem. But now we're all up in arms about 390 students in 1 year. That number, yes, is trending higher, but we jumped 50 kids in 1 year. We have to look long term. Those 390 students are going to be 6th graders. Those 390 students are going to be 9th graders, and they're going to be 12th graders. Do we have the capacity all the way through, not just through 5th grade? Thank you.
Jim and Gary, at one of the previous meetings, we looked at capacity at 6 to 12. It's not in any of the slides here, but I think going forward, we should probably just include that just at least for informational purposes for folks and to provide a broader context. But my recollection was that we had ample capacity at the middle school and the high school to accommodate larger numbers that we're seeing at the elementary school at least right now. Is that correct?
Yes.
But again, I think going forward, incorporating the 6 to 12 picture would be helpful to provide the broader context. Because we aren't just looking at K-5. We should be considering K-12.
Hi, Jim Pouliot, Code 75, Activity Drive in Blue Valley. So I'm of two minds on this, because I was sitting back there and I was thinking exactly what you're saying, that my son will be in junior high school and high school, and there'll be a lot of students in it, and we need to conserve some money for that. But at the same time, I think it's a little naive to just presume that 390 is an outlier, not even considered. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, I moved to the district 4 years ago. Half of the houses in my neighborhood have turned over, and when I started, there were no kids for my son to play with, and now there's about 40 kids in the neighborhood. I can promise you that Mermaid, there are developers living around Mermaid. They've been in my backyard. They've been in my neighbor's backyard putting down stakes. And whether that actually happens, who knows? But I think I agree with the idea that we shouldn't make our plans based on the maximum. But I think we need to be aware that we've paid for this estimate, and there it is. And we're basing the fact that there could be more students in 4 years. But against the background of that, I've got a question for you. I mean, if I come up with a financial plan, I mean, I don't find myself obligated to do it. I mean, we don't have to make a decision in September and then carry it through for 4 years, do we? I mean, why don't you hear it so that you can do construction at different times? And if it looks like a year in or a year and a half in that it is an outlier and we're going to be down to 300 a year, then we can put the brakes on and just develop, make a few classrooms and stop there and save the rest for later. Is that something that's possible?
Yes.
I'm new to the area since we closed down an elementary school in this district, so I guess my question is what is I never really fully understood the reason for that, and, what's their projection of having this happen, what was it, 4 years ago, 4 years after?
I believe the closing massive happened in 2012, maybe?
And it was based on a projection from another company, correct?
Yeah. So it was about 7 years ago at this point, and none of us here, the superintendent and none of the board members were actually around then. We've joined since then. I think Wade might have been around.
While I wasn't on the board, I was aware of what was going on. I was running for the board at that time, and I watched it happen. There were several reasons, some of which were stated, some of which were not. One of the stated reasons it was the only school that was K-4, and that there would be 2 movements. One of the things. The other was the amount of, it was a very small school where the principal was going to cost money. Then there was the other reason that was unstated, and that there was the unique population at Madison was making the school district look bad in the scores. And that was one of the main impetus that the board at that time, as I saw it from the outside, I agree. I must admit, I was not a member of the board, but from what I could see from the outside, that was a major consideration. They wanted to spread the Madison students around so that the district would look better. If you were also around, perhaps you were a parent, and you saw the way the board at that time responded to the parents who were not very happy with the school closing. It was one of the reasons that I am now a member of the board, is because the parents were so enraged by the way they were treated by the then board members that they decided to turn the board over. Now, I know there are many people who would disagree with me, but that was my perception as to what was going on at the time. And Madison is still, would have been still a very small school, and I don't know that it would be large enough to solve the problem that we have today.
We have a familiar face come to the podium.
Board, but I'm not on the board country. No, I'm not really mentioning. Anyway, so Joe, look, I can see both sides of this argument, to be honest with you, and I'm actually glad I'm not that side of the table anymore on this one. I guess my question is, Joe, so I get your point, it's one data point, right? Empirically, all the other years are at or below 338. The red line may or may not be aggressive. I guess my point is this. Let's assume we do nothing, right? Let's assume we project or we assume that the 390 is too high, that we're probably something at or maybe just above the blue. The question is, what do we do? Because I think as the clock ticks, we could end up in a situation where, and by the way, this is fine by me, maybe everybody ends up in a modular at some school, right? I mean, at the end of the day, worst case scenario is it's not like we're going to turn kids away. At the end of the day, we'll have to make accommodations, right? Maybe there's more kids in the class, maybe there's a modular at a couple of schools. And that, look, I don't have a vote as a parent, that's fine by me, but I guess the question is for those that are here, and maybe those that are not here, are you comfortable with that? Because at the end of the day, if everybody thinks the blue number's too low and the red number's too high, then you have to reach somewhere in the middle. And so that's kind of just my 2 cents worth. The other thing, I know, we're way above this, but the $10.9 million for 4 classrooms, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this, so what exactly is a blended solution? Or am I really talking at $10 million for 4 classrooms? Because that would mean that if you build 8 classrooms, you could build a central plant and a swimming pool. So I don't know where the number came from, or is 10.9, I don't know what that number is. I don't know what the blended solution means. I see that, on slides 18, 20, and 22 presumably, one says add 4 classrooms, another one says add 4 classrooms, another one says add 4 classrooms, a multi-purpose room, and renovate common areas. Is that all inclusive, or each of those plans? So the 13.9 is for the 4 classrooms and then the renovation. Just for clarity, because the costs do seem outrageous to add 4 classrooms.
I think it's a good question. The use of the word blended is just to remind us all that there will be some need for modulars along the way until we get to the end of the construction period. So it's a blend of use of modulars, short-term, construction, long-term. The cost for these, it depends. It's not, unfortunately, it's not just an appendage of 4 classrooms, but it's in the case of, say, Bluebell, it would be building a brand new all-purpose room, which is a big structure, multi-story structure, which has its own set of cost per square foot. And then it would be going inside and renovating existing spaces, which may or may not yield themselves to classrooms all that easily.
In the kitchen.
And then renovating the kitchen. So there's some space in the course of creating a more common area, both at Stony and in this case Bluebell or maybe even Shady, we would have to go inside and renovate areas that aren't classrooms now. And cost per square foot of renovation is a good bit more than new construction.
So Jim, the number that's there right up on the screen right now, the 34.3, the 13.9 is cash from capital?
No,
20.4 is?
no, sorry, that's a good.
Like, what are those two figures?
Good question.
Represent?
Those are in all three of the cases, the first number is the 4 classrooms that's somewhere, plus the common space. So in this case, Bluebell has a new multi-purpose room we go inside and renovate. And the second number is the same for all of them. It's the Stony Creek solution piece of it. So those two added together combine to 34.3. The source of that money would be 28 theoretically borrowing, and then the balance in cash.
So then the 13.9 is 4 classrooms at Bluebell, the new multi-purpose room, and then renovating the kitchen.
Well, it's the new multi-purpose room, and then renovate. There will be no standalone classroom, no new classrooms there. It would be renovating old spaces to create 4 classrooms.
So we would be getting rid of the common area that's there now.
Correct.
That would be turned into 4 classrooms.
That's exactly right.
And then creating a new multi-purpose room that is
That would be on the side, yes.
bigger inside? Is that
It would be equivalent to lower equipment.
Hi, I'm Caroline Gaw, the clerk. I have a question about the modular classrooms. They're supposed to be temporary.
Yes. Right now they're
Okay, but what about the ones at Bluebell that have been there now for like 30 years?
They're not there.
They're gone.
They were there for more than 20 years, but they are not there anymore.
Is that what we're expecting modulars to last for 20 years?
No.
Okay.
One thing also to clarify is that all the numbers regarding capacity at Bluebell are not actually counting the added capacity of the modules that are there now. Is that correct, Jim? That's Stony Creek, sorry. Stony Creek.
Correct. They're out there.
Yeah. So in all the numbers that we're looking at, we're not even assuming that the module classrooms that are at Stony Creek now, that were added just recently, we're not even assuming that they're there for purposes of what we're looking at here.
Hi guys, Danielle Schneider, 545 Montgomery Road. I lived with my parents for a year and a half to get my children back into the district that I graduated from. I keep hearing the word on the street, we want to do the same thing. We need to get our kids back in here. People from other districts close by just dying to get back into our district. And I want to know, how specific is the information that we're looking to get from Montgomery County? Like, how detailed is it? Is it going to tell us how many older folks are in homes in the area? Is it going to tell us how many, does anybody know? Does anybody have any clue about that?
It is very, very unlikely that any enrollment projection is going to have the ability to do what you're asking, which is to say, this development is now 50 years old, and the folk are all leaving, and there are going to be young folk that are going to come in behind them. And then for it to truly impact projections, you have to say, not only is that happening, but that's happening at a higher rate than the other development that is now 60 years old or turned over. So that's unlikely. The advantage the Montgomery County Planning Commission has is that they have done an incredible number of projections for school districts in this area. So they're going to have more of a home feel for what's going on in Montgomery County. And we're hopeful that that's going to yield another point from us for us to jump off from. Frankly, some of the other things that they're going to be doing are going to be the exact same that Decision Insight, which is discussions with each one of the municipalities as to where they are in developments. Again, the only difference is going to be Montgomery County Planning Commission is doing that currently, whereas Decision Insight did that back in probably the September timeframe.
Thank you.
My name is Shannon Jackson, resident of Bluebell. I just have a quick question, and I know it's not the core focus of this meeting as far as the long-term solution, but in the meantime, my question is, I'm looking at slide 19 here at the capacity range, and I'm wondering
points, and the answer is yes, there have been. The place where the short-term gap between capacity and enrollment will be the most acute is, as you know, Stony Creek. So I shared these numbers and graphs with Stony's relatively new principal, Paula Gabor-Sasson over there, and she looked at me like, well, Jim, what's the plan? I said, that's why we hired you, Paul, your creativity and your experience as a principal in conjunction with that of the other principals will figure this out. There is no easy answer. There's going to have to be a creative, patient solution, because you can't, sort of what you're getting at, you can't put a module for a lunchroom thing. I mean, you could theoretically, but it wouldn't work that well. So in those intervening years, before we can get the construction online, maybe it's the gentleman who said staging, or asked about staging, definitely a possibility. And one of the things we're looking at is to stage first the all-purpose room to create more capacity, so that maybe it takes the edge off of what you're talking about. But when we do have so many modulars at Stony, and all indications are that there will be, the other parts of the day, lunch, not so much recess, but assemblies, things like that, will require creativity.
So you don't know, basically.
And there is no, we haven't sat down and we haven't mapped it out, largely because we don't really know. You know, we could say, well, what if there's 120 over or something, but we just know that if there are that many modulars, say like a whole grade level, for example, it will be attached. And then the common areas are going to be taxed for sure, yes. They already are taxed, you all know.
Is there fire, not consideration of those rooms, but there's creativity inside, they're not.
Right, one of the solutions would not be to pack everyone in the room at once, because that would violate a whole lot of problems.
Yeah, thank you.
Jim, would it be correct to say that even though ideally we wouldn't want to redistrict twice, that if we were to proceed with construction, given that it's going to take all that time and we can't put kids in a modular cafeteria, is there any likelihood that we could need to redistrict some students in advance of the construction being completed?
I'd say in a normal scenario, the answer to that could be yes. The thing is, the way our district falls in terms of the puzzle pieces, it makes such a scenario very unlikely. I can't see a scenario where we could temporarily carve out district X and Y and move them over to, say, Bluebell, which doesn't have any extra capacity anyway during the construction. So it might be a method to take the edge off a little bit, but I don't think we'll be recommending it because it would just create another problem somewhere else.
Jim, have we looked at a combination of modular classrooms, particularly in Stony and possibly in Shady, in addition to larger structures for common space like an auditorium or cafeteria, new construction? So a blended approach to construction that would include modular and new construction.
Permanent modulars?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to let Steve take that one, because yes, we did take a look at the concept of permanent modulars.
Yes, we did address that. The permanent modular construction is more akin for classroom, highly repetitive, unitary type construction. And whereas, as your question alluded to, it's not as effective for those large support spaces. And the concerns around that are related to durability, to cost, and it is not necessarily a savings per se in construction cost, and we could go into a long explanation as to why. But it's a methodology that's used in certain circumstances at certain locations, but not necessarily an advantage here, in our opinion. So there's numerous reasons why that is, but typically you're looking for construction that's highly repetitive, that may have a constraint in some way related to on-site construction, where it's easier to build it off-site, because you're essentially building it twice, so that's where the cost savings doesn't necessarily come into play. And then you're integrating that with another type of construction with the larger spaces. So It's, in its typical application, its benefits are not really realized in the scenarios we're unfolding right now.
In situations where I've seen it beneficial in either outside of residential use, so in commercial use and school use, would be the time savings, particularly for construction. Typically about 50% time savings.
Right.
But in addition to that, the cost savings would potentially come from having a product built in an off-site location while the foundation is being built, and potentially avoiding high costs of labor on-site that we would traditionally see in this type of application.
Right. Yeah, and that's true. And a lot of times you see it in an urban context because the sites are very constrained. They don't have the space for lay area, that sort of thing, trucking in on it. The data I've seen hasn't supported the time, absolutely, big savings on site. You're still constructing it somewhere else, but it's not on the site. It saves the on-site time. I have not seen data that's really compelling from a cost-saving standpoint, again, because you're building it once, disassembling it, trucking it out, building it again. But, you know, if there's data available that you have, I'd love to look at it.
Possibly.
Okay, thanks.
Good evening. Samantha Hughes, and I'm in 1638 Clearview. So I'm just trying to clarify, as far as the solutions are concerned, for Stony specifically. I understand that this multi-purpose room is, number one, truly needed. Does it have to be a gym though? Could it be a cafeteria? Like, does it have to, I mean, ultimately, if that's going to be the need, is that an option?
It would be. Our thought was to create a space just like Lower Gwinnett has, where it's both. And so it serves dual purpose. It's a big enough space where all the students can congregate at once, and then both the function of lunch and physical education can take place in that one space.
Okay, so then that would take place, that would eliminate the space that's right there now.
Right.
And then that gets converted into classrooms?
Correct.
I see. And then, does that solve the issue for Stony? As far as, does that buy us enough classroom accommodation?
The thought, well, depending on what model we use in terms of how many to create, those blended solutions presented the answer is partially. In Stony's case, there would be some new classroom units attached, probably in some fashion, to the all-purpose room, as well as the interior spaces renovated.
So the renovations that need to happen, are they also going to outfit things like ancient air conditioning and heating systems and just things that are not functioning maybe as well as it could?
The answer is maybe if it makes sense in the course of the construction design, if something is going to have to be touched anyway or adjusted anyway and it's old, that might be the right time to replace it. If it's across the building and not near the new construction, then most likely no.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, thoughts?
Mark Bailey, I live in Northern Shady Road. But I probably do slide 7 or 8. And I guess this question is directed to the board members that are not in favor of construction of this kind of business habit. And looking to eliminate the red. Is it safe to say that you guys are probably on board with the blue line? It's up there.
For me personally, speaking for myself, I think the blue line is a more reasonable one for us to be using for planning purposes. So yes, and just to clarify, I'm not advocating that we do nothing. What I'm not convinced about is doing the degree of construction or additions that some of the options that we talked about at the end are implied. But I do believe we need to do something. It's just I think there's something in between that's lower cost and doesn't take as big of a bet on continued and dramatic enrollment growth to accommodate our current problems.
Okay. Well, one of the comments you made earlier is that that blue line is not that far off from where we are now in capacity, and that we could supplement that with non-traditional solutions. Is that correct? Did I hear that correctly?
It's a relative comment, so if you're looking at, that number is the orange line that is 2329, and then the peak of the blue line is 2500. So then we're talking about an extra 150 seats across 4 schools is what we need to figure out how to manage. Versus if the number turned out to be more like 26, whatever, closer to 2700, that's like double the number of capacity that we need to accommodate. So it's, when I made that comment, it was from a relative perspective.
Understood. I'm just trying to get it from a true relative. And then that orange line represents the compromise. And then the lower, I don't know what color it is, preferred gray is the preferred.
Yeah.
Is it the board stands for individual stances here that were to assume that building our elementary schools to the compromise level is acceptable, or are we looking to build to the preferred?
So to my personal perspective, and the other board members can weigh in, is that I think the compromised line is, the term compromised I think is misused in this case. The compromised capacity is making assumptions that are lower than the Pennsylvania Department of Education's standards for school buildings. The PDE standards would say that our buildings have more space. The number they're using, the compromise number, is actually assuming lower capacity for our buildings, making assumptions that you could fit less kids in classrooms, less kids overall in the building. And then when you get to the preferred one, I believe that the methodology used to come up with that number takes things too far because it makes an assumption that we're taking classrooms out of rotation and we're like turning them into small group instruction rooms. And so to me, I think that's being a little bit excessive. So I personally don't really buy into the quote-unquote preferred capacity thing, and I don't think the compromise capacity is really much of a compromise at all. I mean, it's more than educationally adequate. In fact, it's more worthy than what the Department of Ed says our buildings can accommodate.
And I can add, I'm not opposed to construction at all, so I want to put that forward. But as you know, other people have mentioned, this is a K-12 issue, and part of what we're taxed with as school board members is determining how to use your tax money. And given our borrowing power, which is limited right now. So rather than assuming that we need to spend the amount that we have left to borrow, that would be it. That would be the end of our borrowing power. If we ran into a problem with capacity at the middle school 4 or 5 years from now, we have no borrowing power. So that's part of the concern. And additionally, you know, I'm a retired educator. I will be completely opposed to increasing class size. I don't want to see overcrowded cafeterias. I know what those look like. But I just want to make sure that we're making a sound decision based on, one, not looking at the most extreme projections, but secondly, the numbers I'm hearing about putting on an addition, spending $30 million when, again, an entire elementary school could be built for $45 million makes no sense to me as a person who's going to be spending money. So I want to make sure if we're going to be spending that kind of money, that we're spending it well.
Understood. And I understand your point to a certain degree, but also with one of the options you get 2 multi-purpose rooms. So you have schools right now that don't really have a multi-purpose room with the kids. So now you get those 2 options along with the added capacity, which projected is in the right schools to have happen. So my question was really, if those 2 aren't right, if the compromise will be preferred, is it right? What is the right? And what are we starting to strive for? Where are we at in that study? And I know we mentioned earlier there was a study that the capacity of the middle school and the high school can be pretty high, from my understanding. So I don't know if that's necessarily an issue with the exception of auditorium or something of the
So, Mr. D'Antonio, I'm hearing you talk about this compromised position as it relates to student class size, and I would argue that today we are operating in a place where we are in a compromised position. My child is a third grader in a class of 29 students in a room that's not built to be a classroom, it's built to be a music room. So we are there today. We have been there for many years, which is why Stony Creek and other parents have shown up to rectify this problem. I agree with taking an agile approach. I agree that we need to rectify the public spaces of the schools. It's not just a classroom issue. But I'm also very much concerned about the financial position that we're putting ourselves in. I think, if I can relate it to an individual who maxes out their credit card and now is dipping into their savings. And, God forbid something happens and if we're not replacing HVAC systems and other systems that we had put on the table years ago to fix that aren't getting fixed, we continue to put ourselves in a compromised financial position. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is an educational facility for our kids. And people are moving into our district because of the high quality of education. And, I thank you all for volunteering your time and serving on the board. I know it's an incredible responsibility, but the board is responsible for the financial oversight and the education of our kids. And, I will be looking to the board to continue to push forward how you'll be managing our finances going forward and how you plan to continue to raise capital to get us out of debt so that we can be a world-class education facility.
Can we possibly explain, what types of tax increases districts are allowed to make and what the exception to that would be in terms of referendums and such, so that folks understand?
Could you just repeat?
Yeah, wait, I just think, for clarification, if we could explain what kind of tax increases districts are permitted to make every year at max, and what would it take to have a referendum to increase capital significantly on a short-term basis?
So the second part is the referendum is simply a question that goes out. It's a ballot question as part of a separate polling and/or it could be part of a primary or a November election. And you ask the community, do you want to spend $50 million for the XYZ project? And it states the impact, and it's a yes or no question. So it could be separate or it could be part of it. In Pennsylvania, there's only been 2 successful, and there's been many more unsuccessful. The limitations on taxes in Pennsylvania at this point, each year you have an Act 1 index, which generally more or less is like a CPI type index increase. And then there are certain exceptions, which at this point, our retirement system, PSERS, is an exception on top of that, but that is going to increasingly get smaller and smaller. And then another exception that is viable, but not going to be every year, is going to be special education. Most of the other exceptions that districts have been using are going away. So more or less, increasingly, it looks like districts are going to be closer to Act 1 plus special education.
So while I understand that on paper, the middle and high school have capacity, the high school students would say differently. But what we're not talking about, we're talking about physical plant right now. We're not talking about the fact that as these students go through the school district, go through these grades, we need more teachers every year. We're going to need more teachers in the middle school. We're going to need more teachers in the high school. And all of that will be added to our existing budget. So it's not just spending $34 million to build new space. It's also the ongoing expense of additional teachers, which we need new teachers, that's fine to accommodate our kids. But there's just so much in that bucket of money. and we need to be mindful that this is not a K-5 problem, and it should not be pushed as a K-5 problem. It's a K-12 problem. How are we holistically going to deal with the increase of students as they move through the district, not just as they move through elementary school?
Any other questions, thoughts, ideas? Any more from the board?
What's next?
Just want to just want to remind the group this evening as we bring this meeting to a close that our community meetings are scheduled for March 20th, 21, April 9th, and the 23rd at the 4 schools listed. These are also posted on the website, and we look forward to meeting with you in smaller settings and answer your questions and hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for coming this evening.